die here if you don't move today. You will die tomorrow. You can't survive here.
I'm sure the Biden administration has never moved money from one bucket to the other. They ought to be moving money to the bucket that supports American citizens.
The idea that somebody would be playing political games for the sake of himself, but this is so consistent about Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. He puts himself before the needs of others.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Looming over our political coverage today, Paradise Lost. No, not the 17th century epic poem by John Milton, but what part of Florida's paradise could be lost to Hurricane Milton? Fearing the worst, President Biden canceled a scheduled overseas trip as that hurricane moves toward Florida. Ahead, in just a moment, we will have the latest on Milton. On the campaign trail, Vice President Kamala Harris is joining several popular TV shows in New York City today. She's already made stops at The View and The Howard Stern Show. Tonight, she will be on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Last night, you might have noticed, I certainly hope you did, she was on CBS News' 60 Minutes and was questioned on everything from the war in Israel to her vision for the economy.
My plan is about saying that when you invest in small businesses, you invest in the middle class, and you strengthen America's economy.
Importantly, former President Trump decided not to take part in his own 60 Minutes interview. Today, he canceled a virtual health care event due to the looming storm in Florida. We start tonight in Florida. Our Manuel Bojorquez is tracking Hurricane Milton from Orlando. Manny, what can you tell us?
Well, Major, we're at a gas station that has been busy throughout the entire afternoon, even with a line at times and people arguing over gas pumps at times as they try to get their final preparations in order and as Milton closes in. We do know that tonight the state of Florida is asking the Florida Highway Patrol to escort tanker trucks into gas stations along the evacuation zone to replenish the supply as the hurricane begins to move in, because the time to prepare is starting to dwindle. So what do we have here in Orlando? Even though it's not supposed to get the worst of the storm surge that will hit the West Coast, you have people from the West Coast who are filling the shelters and the hotels here, but they will still not escape the impacts of a hurricane, because currently the forecast has it as a Category 2 over Orlando, 90 miles inland from where it may make landfall. So there are preparations here in Orlando itself for what could be prolonged power outages when trees and power lines go down, and for flash flooding that could come with the rainfall that's expected.
Manny, as you know, having covered many of these storms, they are times of testings for governors and state emergency management teams. What is Governor DeSantis saying today?
Well, he's trying to make the point clear that the time to evacuate is now and that it will soon close. And we have heard from people who rode out Helene who said, we saw how bad that was, and if this is expected to be worse, we're not willing to take our chances. Our home may not be there when we get back, but we want to escape this one with our lives. So from the governor and the federal government and forecasters, it seems, given what this area just experienced with Helene, that the message is getting across to get to higher ground and to do so quickly, because by this time tomorrow, even here into the Orlando area, we could already be starting to see the first impacts, outer bands, the rain that could start to flood roads develop, and people do not need to be traveling in that.
Manny, have you encountered anyone there who's going to try to ride this out?
You know, people here in Orlando may decide to stay in their homes because they're not expected to get the storm surge. Our experience in talking to people here has been that those who live along the West Coast, where the storm surge was bad enough with Helene, which did not make a direct impact in that area, it sideswiped it, that they're not willing to take their chances this time. In Fort Myers, which was hit hard 2 years ago, I'm getting messages from people saying, God, I wish I could stay home, but this one, based on what we saw last time, we're going to have to get out. So the message is being heard loud and clear. There may always be people that decide to stay, and the emergency authorities have told them, look, there is a point where if you need emergency aid, we may not be able to get to you.
Manuel Bojorquez, as always, thank you very much. Now to the campaign. Jake Rosen and Scott MacFarlane joins us now. Jake here at the table, Scott MacFarlane at the White House. Scott, you put into our system earlier this afternoon a letter written by a Republican member of the House from North Carolina, attempting in one place at one time to combat a blizzard, if you will, of disinformation about Helene. Can you summarize some of that for us, please?
This is quite a moment for any member of Congress, Major, trying to respond and get all the federal assets to your constituents who've been hammered by a natural disaster. Chuck Edwards of Western North Carolina represents those mountainous areas, those areas that were just pillaged by Hurricane Helene. But he spent part of his day having to craft this letter to the public and to his constituents, debunking the myths, knocking down the conspiracy theories and the misinformation that has pervaded this entire storm, the aftermath, and the federal recovery. Among the things he says in the letter, Major, is that the government doesn't control the weather. This was not an operation of the government to pillage or target North Carolina, that he's dedicating some of his bandwidth to that mission while also trying to help his constituents respond to this disaster tells you how combustible, how toxic this disinformation is and how important it is for stakeholders, both parties at many levels, to try to knock this down.
I want to bring in Jake Rosen because one of the loudest voices contributing to this cloud, if you will, of disinformation and misinformation and deliberate deception is former President Trump, who has said many things that are not true, provably false, that money is not going to hurricane victims. Instead, billions have been stolen and given to undocumented immigrants. Not true. That there have been no helicopter flights for rescue. When he said it, not true. And other things amplified by those in the Trump media echo chamber. Address that, Jake.
Well, one of the biggest new alliances in the kind of MAGA world is Elon Musk and Donald Trump. We saw on Saturday in Butler, Pennsylvania, Elon Musk sharing the stage with the former president for the first time in a very profound moment and rally for the former president, with all camera eyes, all eyes of Trump supporters on that rally to prove this alliance. And Trump, for the last week, has been touting what Elon Musk has done in places like North Carolina, Tennessee, in terms of helping with Starlink. But at the same time, what Elon Musk is also doing is pouring gasoline on this fire of media, of misinformation and lies, frankly, about what's going on there. And Elon Musk has been talking about how this changes the election and how this will impact Republicans not being able to vote. Donald Trump has also echoed that. When you talk about the flights, Elon Musk was personally attacking Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg over this, saying he was hearing calls from people, without being specific, who couldn't land aid helicopters. Donald Trump has spread the same lies continually for over a week now about what is going on the ground there, even though he's been there and heard from people like Brian Kemp, heard from people
Governor
like
of Georgia, Republican,
and the governor of South Carolina,
Henry McMaster,
who both have said that they're getting the assistance and what they need in terms of this hurricane. We've also heard from Republican local officials, not just the congressman that Scott mentioned, but also mayors of towns in Tennessee who are saying this needs to stop because our constituents don't trust us with what we're doing, which again, when you come back to elections, when you come back to what the services the government provides for constituents, it's very hard when they don't trust what they're being given, especially in a time of grieving and crisis in these communities.
Scott, I want to go back to you for a moment because it's important for our audience to know, if it doesn't already, the origin story of the controlling the weather part of this that Chuck Edwards, Republican of North Carolina, had to spend time in this lengthy letter combating. Give us the origin story on that.
It's one of his colleagues, Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene, had made a social media post saying that there was, or at least alluding to the possibility that there's control of the weather by people. They put that aside because that is it's a conspiracy theory that he's knocking down inside his own party. There are broader concerns about how this disinformation is hampering the federal response and hampering, perhaps, the choice by people in Florida to evacuate, Major. If there's any dubiousness, if there's any lack of trust in government forecasting, there's concern that may be a disincentive for people to get out of Florida right now, as they should be. Let's also put that aside for a moment, because there's a new concern emerging that Congress will have to deal with and deal with promptly. They are running short on some federal aid in the Small Business Administration Disaster Loan Program. They have only a matter of weeks of funding left after Milton strikes. And there's a call now among some members of Congress and members of the administration for Congress to do something about that before their target date of returning to Washington in mid-November. That's going to be a pressing issue over the next few days.
Jake, I want to turn to you very briefly because in the last 24 hours, Trump has begun to softly back away from some of this disinformation about Helene, in much the way he and J.D. Vance have backed away from the misinformation and disinformation deliberately spread about Springfield, Ohio. This looks like a pattern.
It certainly is, and it's something that they've done repeatedly for the last couple of months, not just in the recent weeks since Donald Trump brought up the Springfield, Ohio issue and what's going on there, but these are based in grains of truth, right? That people in Springfield feel an influx of people who are not from their community.
And some services were stressed.
Absolutely. We see in Aurora,
which we have covered repeatedly here.
And in Aurora, Colorado, where Donald Trump is going later this week to make that point to constituents there, holding a rally there to further politicize what's going on there. But we've also seen this just across the country when Donald Trump talks about what's going on with the storm in terms of just there is a grain of truth. Maybe you don't see FEMA on your block that day, right? At the same time, that doesn't mean that they're not working. There are thousands of people, thousands of chainsaws, millions and billions of dollars pouring into these communities. Again, it's a federal agency. It might take a little bit of time to get there, but in terms of telling people that the aid is not on the way, telling people are deliberately blocking the trucks, those things are not true. They feed the anxiety and the anger. Again, as these communities, especially in places like North Carolina, where the Congressman Chuck Edwards pointed out, are certainly grieving for full towns completely lost, people looking for something to grab onto, and Trump is giving them further anger and further fuel onto that anger.
And by the time the fact-check cavalry arrives, they've moved on to something else and start soft-pedaling something that got them extravagant headlines and a lot of attention a few days before. Jake Rosen and Scott McFarlane at the White House, thank you very much.
This could be the worst storm hit Florida in over a century.
President Biden, as I mentioned, has canceled a scheduled overseas trip to monitor Hurricane Milton. What he's saying about the risks. That's next. You're streaming America Decides.
If you're under evacuation orders, you should evacuate now. You should have already evacuated. It's a matter of life and death.
Welcome back to America Decides. That is a presidential plea to those in the path of Hurricane Milton. President Biden was also asked about something we just talked about, those peddling disinformation about storm relief. Let's listen.
Those who do it to try to damage the administration. Well, we can take care of ourselves. But it misleads people. It puts people in circumstances where they panic.
Senior advisor to the president, Tom Perez, joins us now. Tom, you've heard the president talk about this. Local officials in the path of Hurricane Milton have said to residents, if you intend to stay in designated evacuation areas, you could very likely die as a result of this storm. Sometimes local officials are accused of hyping things. It doesn't feel or look like this is hyping.
This is not hyping. This is about getting people to listen to their local officials and move out of harm's way. If you are subject of an evacuation order, please heed it. We don't want to go to funerals. We want to make sure that everybody is safe. And that's exactly what we're doing now. The preparation is ongoing. We have over 1,000 federal personnel on the streets getting ready for this. We have 20 million meals pre-positioned. We have 40 million liters of water. We have all sorts of equipment to enable us to address the aftermath. We're here to help everybody. And the most important thing that people could do right now is heed the evacuation orders.
Tom, I want to ask you about something I saw from one of the local leaders who said, if you're going to stay, please do us a favor. Use a Sharpie, write your name on your arm so we can identify you when we find you. That's an alarming image. Is that an image that's consistent with what the White House believes this storm could actually do to those areas most in the target range?
Oh, this storm has potentially catastrophic consequences. And that's what the experts are telling us. And this is a storm, barely 10 days removed from Helene. And so we have to make sure we take these admonitions seriously. This is no moment to say, well, I don't know if I agree with that. Please trust the experts. If you have been the subject of an evacuation order, get out. And that way, you and your family won't be wondering down the road, where are you?
You mentioned Helene. One of the things that I think the audience should be mindful of, when ground is saturated, as it is in Florida, as it is in other places, but particularly in the line of fire of this storm, saturated ground makes it much more difficult for storm surge or rain to go to new places. It just becomes much more of a localized problem that intensifies very, very rapidly. One of your concerns has to be that.
Absolutely, and especially in Tampa, which is an area that is a potential bullseye. If the storm, as predicted, moves west to east, that's the worst possible trajectory, because as folks down there know, Tampa is at sea level. And so even if it moves over Tampa as a Category 3 or a Category 4, the category doesn't necessarily predict what the storm surge will be. And so that's why it's so important to evacuate, because a Category 3 storm could still have storm surge that can have real life and death consequences, which is why heeding the admonition of folks is so critically important at this moment.
Do you believe it will be necessary before the election, Tom, for the president to call Congress back to authorize and appropriate more funds, both for Helene, but also now Milton?
No, the president has said, and the FEMA director has said, that we have the resources to get us through these storms right now. But it's equally clear that the president, and he has said this, will be asking Congress for an additional appropriation. The consequences of the upcoming storm and Helene are literally in the billions of dollars. When we reached the agreement a few weeks ago to keep the government open until December 20th, we had asked Congress for more money for storm-related issues. We couldn't get the Republicans to agree. I'm hopeful that this time, in the run-up to December 20th, when we have to fund the federal government for the next fiscal year, I'm hopeful and confident that we will come together in a bipartisan way. I wish it had been done before, but they didn't want to do it. But this time around, I'm hopeful that that will happen.
Tom, as you well know, the president is in Milwaukee today. He's making an announcement about an EPA rule related to lead pipes. Explain why that's part of the pitch in the final month of this campaign.
Well, getting rid of all lead-infested service lines has been a mantra for President Biden and Vice President Harris since 2021. They made a commitment that we will get rid of and replace all lead service lines in homes and in critical businesses like daycare centers in the next 10 years. This is a public health imperative, and today's announcement is the culmination of quite literally years of work and the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which contains dedicated funding to make sure we implement this. Lead in your bloodstream, there is no acceptable level of lead, Major, for anyone, especially youngsters. And this is something that the president has been calling for since day one, and the vice president as well. And I'm very excited about it. And the reason he's in Milwaukee, in no small measure, is that Wisconsin has been ahead of the curve. A number of jurisdictions along the Great Lakes region, like Milwaukee and Detroit, got a head start on lead pipe replacement by using some of their original dollars they got through the American Rescue Plan. They now have money through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and they're going to, I'm sure, meet and probably exceed that 10-year replacement goal to get them all replaced. That's really important, and it's a basic human right. You shouldn't worry about whether the water you drink is going to hurt you or possibly even kill you.
Tom Perez coming to us via Zoom in Chicago. Thank you very much for your time as always.
Thank you.
You can check your calendar less than 4 weeks until Election Day. So a question we always ask ourselves here, where do Harris and Trump stand in the polls? The man with our numbers, our polling expert, your friend and mine, Anthony Salvanto, standing by. That's next. You're streaming America Decides.
We have to win this election. If we don't win this election, there's tremendous consequence for everything. I say that November 5th will be the most important day in the history of our country.
Welcome back to America Decides. As we mentioned, less than a month from Election Day. And just over 2 million Americans have already cast ballots. Early voting has begun in 26 states. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now. As I always do, Anthony, my first question is simple. Take it away.
Well, look, Major, with 4 weeks to go, I figured it's never too soon to start walking people through the map. Yes, this is a close race. Yes, either candidate can win. These white states, as our viewers will perhaps know very well, are the battlegrounds. They are tight. But what has changed since 2020 seems like a good starting point. And the larger story there, Major, is that since you and I stood in front of this map in 2020, the growth in America has happened more in states in the South, right? Across the Sun Belt. We'll talk a lot about that. A little bit in the West as well. Okay, that's the relative growth. And what that means is that the electoral vote counts have shifted a little bit since the latest census. What that means for the political map is that you'll hear a lot about the blue wall for Democrats, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. They're worth relatively less than they were in 2020. So Pennsylvania, for example, lost a seat. Michigan lost a seat. North Carolina is up one. Republican-leaning states like Texas and Florida gained in this count. So what does that shift mean? Let me walk you through one scenario. When we talk about states that Kamala Harris might try, certainly will want to win, that Joe Biden did, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, in this hypothetical, that doesn't get her to 270, winning those. She'd have to flip what we often talk about as the blue dot, right? The Nebraska 2nd congressional district there, or one of those other Sun Belt states to get to 270. That's just one example of how the math has shifted a little bit with the population shifts that have gone on in recent years, Major.
And in about 45 seconds, Anthony, it's worth noting that we've added North Carolina to this mix of battleground states when it wasn't there even 3 months ago. That seems to me worth noting.
I think some of the demographic shifts that have taken place in North Carolina, you see fast-growing areas in and around Raleigh-Durham have been a major part of that. But of course, with what we're seeing and the devastation there, I think it'll be very interesting to see how the operations of voting play out in that state. Certainly something we're going to watch over the coming weeks, Major.
And the State Board of Elections in North Carolina made a series of decisions yesterday to expedite and protect the ability of North Carolinians in Western North Carolina ravaged by Hurricane Helene to do exactly that, participate to the fullest. Anthony Salvanto, thank you very much. We don't use the terminology legendary journalist very much, but it applies to Bob Woodward. He has a new book that contains several expletive-laced political bombshells. Here are just a few of the revelations from the new book titled War. While in the White House, former President Trump sent a shipment of COVID tests to Vladimir Putin for the Russian president's personal use. The Trump campaign responded to the book, calling them, quote, made-up stories. The book also reveals what can only be described as a complicated relationship between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, complicated even further by the October 7th attacks from Hamas on Israeli civilians. The book includes President Biden describing Netanyahu as, quote, a bad effing guy who, quote, gives a S only about himself. Like I said, there are some expletives in the book. You can catch Bob Woodward's conversation with my colleague David Martin for CBS Sunday Morning, where they discuss all of this and much more. You can see that conversation this Sunday right here on CBS. From daytime TV to late night TV, Vice President Harris hits the airwaves. Our political panel will digest that and much more next. You're streaming America Decides.
If anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
Ultimately, I do believe that this is an election that is about strength versus weakness.
Yeah.
And weakness as projected by someone who puts himself in front of the American people.
Welcome back to America Decides. Good to have you with us. That's a couple of moments of note from Vice President Harris's interviews today. First on The View, then The Howard Stern Show. Vice President is also taping an interview on CBS's The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, as the title suggests, that will air later tonight. Our political panel joins me now. Names and resumes, stand by. Chuck Rocha, Democratic strategist who formerly served as senior advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns. Kevin Sheridan, formerly served spokesperson for the Republican National Committee, also a senior advisor for the Romney-Ryan 2012 presidential campaign. Kevin, I want to start with you. Saw you nodding, probably metaphorically salivating at that answer from the vice president about anything that she would have done differently of the Biden administration. Do you likely to expect to see that in a Trump ad sometime soon?
They've spent the entire time, the Democrat campaign has spent the entire time trying to distance them from Joe Biden, and in one soundbite, she undid that. And that, of course, that's already a digital ad. I'm sure they'll put some money behind it. That's going to do some real damage to her. She also couldn't answer.
Why?
Because it goes the entire core of what she's been saying, that she's change, and that's not change. That's the opposite of change. That's 4 more years of the exact same thing that we have. And she also did damage on fracking, on not being able to answer why she's changed her position on that, on picking a fight with Ron DeSantis today for no reason at all. When his state is about to be obliterated by a Cat 5 hurricane, hopefully not, but just a real bad week for her, and I think she did some real damage.
Chuck, bad week, and it's only Tuesday, according to Kevin Sheridan.
No doubt. Republicans always say it's going to be a bad week when we're whooping that butt. That's what I'm going to say. They've had a good week, and she's not doing what she should be doing, is talking to the press and getting out. Look,
Give
we're
me
at
some
the
data
end.
on the whooping their butt part of that.
We are at the end of the persuasion part of this campaign. If you really care about the issues that my brother Eric is talking about, you're right. You've made up your mind. You're probably going to be on Team Blue or Team Red. This is about getting out the vote and about coming across as somebody you trust or somebody you like in a presidential campaign. Donald Trump didn't have some deep policy book. We didn't go into the analytics of all the things that he talked about. He got up and put his whole logo on the front of a red hat. And it was simple enough for America to go, yeah, that seems pretty cool. Let's break some things. And they trusted that he would do that. Now they know what they got, and they're going to make a choice of getting out the vote. The difference in this election will be folks that nobody's polling that are new to this race, either for Trump or for Harris, who haven't been caught because they just came of age lately, and we don't know how many of them, because we know if everybody that voted in the last election, it's going to be razor thin just like it is now.
New voters are not going to be voting for 4 more years of the same. If she's out there saying she's 4 more years of the same, she can't think of a single thing that she would change, that's
If that in fact was true, we would be losing by 5. I'm just saying that all the polls can't be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, I want to play for you a soundbite of someone you know and I believe still respect, Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, about what former President Trump has said recently about Hurricane Helene relief efforts. Let's play that.
The amount of disinformation is really extraordinary, although it's not just being put out by the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, former President Trump told us that the people in Springfield are eating dogs and cats, all right? I mean, he likewise said that FEMA money, our emergency money, instead of helping the people that have been hit by the hurricane, is being used to help illegals. I mean, he just makes it up.
He just makes it up. True. Fact check true. Lately.
Well, I will say the online conversation has gotten pretty wild out there right now. I mean, people are talking about.
And even local officials in North Carolina are saying this is intimidating people or giving them bad information that they're actually vectoring off or acting on that is hampering efforts.
It's hard to
rescue them or to recover in the areas most severely hit.
He's making a point, and that's why he's getting off Twitter or X. And I think
meaning Senator Romney.
Senator Romney, I believe he said that today. But yeah, The people of North Carolina and Florida come first. We don't know the actual facts in some of these cases. So saying definitively that FEMA money is getting to North Carolina or not is something that I just don't know the answer to. And I sit on X and try to figure this stuff out all day. But yeah, it's no secret that Senator Romney is not going to stand for any kind of misinformation out there. But we just, honestly, we don't know the full picture right now.
Chuck, you mentioned this choice that people are going to make. Does this factor into the choice that people are going to make?
It makes my point, is it's motivation to the far right or the far left. I've seen Democrats do the same thing. So this ain't a partisan thing. We all give red meat, and this is red meat going, all them Democrats is trying to keep that money from going down to these good red states like Florida. It's a motivational factor, and I get the strategy. You know, game respects game, and I understand that. The real factor is my mama is 72, and I got a pregnant niece who's 9 months pregnant, who I had to talk them into getting in a car from Fort Myers, Florida today, and drive south to Miami to go stay with one of my fishing guide buddies, because I was like, look, this is going to be real. My sister and my brother-in-law are grown people, and they can stay there and fight this. Somebody get my mama in a car and get her out of there and get her somewhere, because they were like, oh, it's not going to be that bad. I've been seeing on social media. I'm like, no, it's going to be really bad. Not that they've been affected by Democrat or Republican ploy, but it's real people's lives, to Eric and mine point.
And disbelieving or undercutting experts, which is something that played out entirely on the stage of the vice presidential debate, doesn't help in situations like this.
Now, I would agree with that. And I think what you're seeing now here at the end, it was 29 days out. Lots of folks are voting. Lots of folks are getting information. It's like, it's really key for these campaigns to be using this last little bit to get every vote that they can get out, but do it in a fair way. Like, if I get beat by a Republican, I'm good with getting beat by it, but let's get beat on the issues.
The experts have been wrong a lot in the last 5 years.
Last word, Kevin Sheridan. Thank you. Appreciate it. Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin sees her lead narrow in Wisconsin. The new numbers, they're next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back. A new and, dare we say, knowledgeable report finds that a key Senate contest has significantly narrowed. The Cook Political Report with Amy Walter has shifted the Wisconsin race between Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin and Republican challenger Eric Hovde from lean Democrat to toss-up. In August, surveys from the Cook Political Report found Baldwin leading Hovde by 7 points. Now, its latest polling shows the Democratic lawmaker holding a 2-point edge over Hovde. Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report, Jessica Taylor, joins us now. Jessica, always great to have you with us.
Great to be back.
What's going on in Wisconsin?
I think sort of Wisconsin is Wisconsining in a way. This is probably
meaning a long history of very close statewide elections.
Right. The last Senate race there in 2022 was decided by a point. You know, Baldwin.
String of governor's races for almost 2 decades, yes. Very close.
Yeah, it is probably maybe the most closely divided state we have in the country, is close to a 50-50 state. And I think that, you know, we have seen, this is the story in a lot of these Senate races, that you saw Republicans sort of underperforming Trump's numbers. They're sort of beginning to consolidate. And, you know, our polling, again, as you said, showed a big jump in the poll from our last survey in August. And this mirrors both Republican and Democratic internal polling that I've seen in the state, where this is a margin of error race. And I think, you know, as the presidential race goes, there's a good chance the Senate race could go as well.
That's why we have Jessica here in the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, because not only do you evaluate things that everyone can see, you talk to the campaigns, and sometimes, for their own benefit, they share their internal data, which gives you a better granular sense of where races are.
Yeah, a lot of this internal data is more targeted. It can focus more in. And so, you know, we look at the public polling too, but we do see a lot of private data. And so, you know, we're not publishing that, but it's when we're talking with our sources that we see
it informs your judgment, moving these things from one category to another. Talk to us about Michigan and Ohio.
So Michigan is another one that I think, you know, internal polling over the past few weeks has had this
open race.
It's an open seat race. It's the most competitive open seat race on the map there, with Democrat Alyssa Slotkin and Republican Mike Rogers. You have Rogers, a former FBI agent, Slotkin, a former CIA analyst. But, you know, I think they have their first debate tonight, in fact. So I think, you know, Slotkin is ahead slightly, but I think it's still a very close race. We're watching this one. You know, both Michigan and Wisconsin have seen millions of dollars of infusions from national Republicans from the Senate Leadership Fund, the major super PAC aligned with Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. And then Ohio is probably the truest toss-up that we have at this juncture.
Fascinating. fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this is a race that, Sherrod Brown, in a state that Trump carried twice by 8 points. He's running against Republican Bernie Moreno. Now, Republicans did release an internal poll there today showing it tied, but some of the polls we've seen have had Brown with a small but consistent lead. His opponent, Bernie Moreno, I think has sort of been underperforming Trump's numbers there. He's been slower to consolidate the Trump base. It's not that much different than the 2022 race there, where J.D. Vance was also lagging behind for much of the race. I think that Brown has just overwhelmed him on spending. And, Moreno, he's been hit for things he said about abortion rights and things in the state. He's sort of been assailed by Democratic attacks on that and on his businesses. But, Brown still very tough to win in a presidential year in that state.
So if anyone was looking at the numbers, meaning the polling data, 2 months ago, they would have seen these Democrats running ahead of Kamala Harris. Now, she was newly minted then.
Right.
Now things seem to be getting closer in the sense that they're running about the same numbers. Does that strike you, Jessica, as things just reverting to where they should be, or a trend that is possibly worrisome for some of these Democrats?
I think they're reverting to a little bit of where they should be. In 2016, we saw every single Senate race go the same way as the presidential race. In 2020, only Susan Collins managed to win re-election, even as Biden carried her state. So I think in these sort of blue wall states, we are seeing some of that, sort of coming
convergence.
Convergence, exactly. I will say two races where we aren't seeing that, though, are in Arizona and Nevada. Those are races we still rate as lean Democratic, but we've seen the Democrats have much larger leads in there. I think you have a weaker opponent in Arizona with Carrie Lake, who's still, behind significantly, even as some polls have had Trump winning the state. And I think in Nevada, Sam Brown had the potential to be a stronger candidate. He hasn't raised as much money, I think, as he needed to. Democrat Jackie Rosen has really been able to overwhelm him on fundraising and put out a big lead there.
Jessica Taylor, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here. Colorado judge who sentenced an election denier to prison is now receiving threats. Former Mesa County Clerk Tina Peters will spend nearly 9 years behind bars for a data breach scheme that was sparked by false claims about the 2020 election. During sentencing last week, Judge Matthew Barrett said Peters abused her position and called her a charlatan. Law enforcement is now vetting multiple threats lodged against that judge and his court staff. Security has also been ramped up at the courthouse. Behind both presidential campaigns is a contingent of women, and they're volunteering to help. We'll take a look at how they could make a difference in the race for the White House. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. In their own way, Vice President Harris and former President Trump are vying for the attention and the support of all voters. Interestingly, both candidates have specialized teams to reach out to female voters. Our Natalie Brand traveled to neighboring Virginia to speak with some of the organizers of those teams.
Behind the scenes of Campaign 2024, a grassroots groundswell of volunteers.
Ladies, let's make the history.
Particularly women working to turn out the vote for the candidate of their choice.
I feel like we're kind of the secret army that gets things done.
That includes postcard writing parties like this Northern Virginia gathering in support of Vice President Kamala Harris.
What kind of difference do you think an event like this can make?
Every postcard makes a difference. Every door knock, just talking to somebody makes a difference.
Women for Harris organizers Amanda Linton and Nancy Fatemi are honing in on the battleground states.
We're all gas, no brakes.
I think we're the winning difference for Kamala Harris.
In Richmond, Virginia, the Republican women's group Rally Virginia is organizing for former President Donald Trump.
It is going to be the largest all women's rally in North America this year.
Founder Ruse Dadaboy says part of the group's work is trying to bring suburban women back to the GOP.
If we can talk to the independent-minded women, then we're doing our job.
While polls show Harris holding a lead with women voters, Trump supporters are talking up the former president's policies.
Sometimes it's a bitter pill to swallow, but I tell you, I've been able to just separate the person and his personality traits from his policies.
Your top issues, Tina?
My top issues are the economy and safety. And I think they're very closely tied together.
On the other side,
very important for me that we protect our democracy.
We're not going to sit back and watch our children and our grandchildren have fewer rights than we had.
While these two groups of women are working for different outcomes, they share the same dedication, whether by pen or phone, in the run-up to Election Day.
Natalie Brand joins us now. Natalie, my notes suggest to me that you found something that the Harris and Trump camps actually agree on. What is it?
Well, supporters across both sides agree, Major, that the stakes could not be higher this November. The Democratic women I spoke to, they view this election as one about saving, protecting democracy. The Republican women I spoke to, they believe the country is moving way too far to the left. They view this election as one about saving the future of the country for their families and for future generations. They also agree, Major, that volunteer activism, like what we saw in that piece, really matters, that their role is to reach out to all the voters and really convey the message that every vote matters this election, especially in the key battleground states that we've been talking about all season long. And while we saw very impassioned supporters across both sides, I do have to note, I asked the Women for Harris Coalition about how many volunteers they have in their grassroots group. One of the national organizers said upwards of 1 million women. I asked the Trump campaign how many women volunteers they estimate they have, and a spokeswoman says around thousands across the country.
Well, that's a pretty big contrast, 1 million to thousands. As you note, President Harris has about a double-digit, slightly more than that, lead among women over former President Trump. How do his female supporters, that is to say former President Trump's supporters, intend or try to erode some of that advantage for the vice president?
Well, Major, the group I spoke to, headquartered in Richmond, they formed in 2021 to organize around Governor Youngkin's campaign in 2022. They believe they have a powerful network across Virginia and that they're going to throw their full support behind the top of the ticket. And, you know, former President Trump, they hope that other groups nationwide are doing the same thing. But I also have to tell you about another category of women I've found in my reporting over the past several months, and that is undecided Republican women. During a recent trip to battleground Pennsylvania, I was speaking to voters in a suburb outside Philadelphia, and over the span of just about 30 minutes, I found 3 Republican women who told me that they were just completely conflicted over what to do in November. One woman told me she felt like a Republican without a party. Another one said that she's completely undecided, but recognizes that she has to vote since her state is such a key battleground. And I've also been checking in with former supporters, current still supporters of Nikki Haley, who supported her during primary season, are still upset that she did not make it to the general. And one of them told me today that she still plans on writing in Nikki Haley. So while we definitely see enthusiastic, loyal Trump supporters, this dynamic remains of less enthusiastic, still undecided Republican women. Major.
Natalie Brand, thank you very much. That does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.